Hey Optimancers, Chris here. So Wild Shape, it's cool, but it's not easy to optimize around once we get into those upper single digit levels, and it's even harder once we get to high levels. That means in order to optimize our Wild Shaping Druid, we need to make careful decisions in order to get the most out of our Wild Shape features, as well as to make sure our racial features, our feats, our class and subclass features, and spell selections are working well when we use Wild Shape. If you've been watching this series, you should already have a pretty good handle on what forms are the best to Wild Shape into, what feats will support your Wild Shape Druid, and what races are going to give us some cool and powerful options in our Wild Shape forms. Now we're going to get to a tricky one, spells. So if you have Wild Shape, then you'll automatically have some spells because we'll have a minimum 2 levels in Druid, Moon Druid specifically, but of course, spells from other lists are available through multi-classing, setting specific backgrounds, magic items, and more. But we need to look at spells differently when we're making a character focused on Wild Shape. The elephant in the room, of course, is that you can't cast spells while you're Wild Shaped. The only way around that is 18 levels in Druid. In other words, for most characters, there's simply no way around it. However, Wild Shape isn't like a Barbarian's Rage in that we can in fact concentrate on spells while we're Wild Shaped. So when we look at spells, we need to look at them from the perspective of a character that hasn't Wild Shaped yet, but will still benefit from those spells once their Wild Shape is active. It's like the queenside castle in chess. It's not as easy to set up, but still effective when done right. So we're going to look at spellcasting, and I'm mainly concentrating on spells from levels 1 through 4, and we'll see what options are standing out for us. For what should be an obvious reason, I'll be mainly focusing on Druid spells. If you enjoyed my content and you would like to support it, please find the link to my Patreon page in the video description. Patrons see these videos early and without the YouTube ads, and there's a bunch of rewards. Check out my Patreon page to find them all, and one of them is a video call-out, as these people are about to receive. Aaron Culler, Rob Reichelt, Awesome Face, Benjamin, Bloody Nine, Brett McDowell, CJ, Dash Panther, Dave Peters, David Lotz, David W. Skibbins, Drew Terry, Gakumaru, Horby, Ian Johnson, James Thomas, Jadzan, Jonathan Luxey, K.J. Aurelio, Kurt Chi, Lee LeMay, LaFerja, Marlon Rooks, Nathaniel McCauley, Nick Lutz, Nick Simmons, Rysquy, Sajid Abraham, Sam S., Scott Dunnington, Scott Shields, Steven Edmondson, TUM, Tom Tom, Victor Klassen, and Zachary Shapiro. Thanks all so much for your support. Let's get started. Okay, so we're going to start with cantrips, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. Most cantrips that are going to be available to us, we just won't be able to use with Wild Shape at all. And those that we can use, for the most part, are giving us very, very minor benefits. What's probably the most effective cantrip for a Wild Shape Druid isn't even a Druid cantrip, and that would be the Light spell. The thing is, your race may provide you Dark Vision, but that's one racial feature that very clearly doesn't pass over to your Wild Shape form. Once we get into Elemental Wild Shape, we're going to have Dark Vision, but a lot of those lead-up forms don't have Dark Vision built in, so a Light spell could be very handy indeed. Though we don't necessarily need multiple Light cantrips, so if you are going to need the Light spell, I would probably just talk to other players and see who's playing spellcasters with cantrips, and find out who can fit the Light cantrip on their list. Guidance is a possibility to set up, a boost to your initiative roll. You could potentially throw magic stones while Wild Shape if you need a ranged option. You could even potentially concentrate on a resistance cantrip, but regardless, we're probably talking short durations for very limited benefits, so let's get into the meatier options, our leveled spell options. So the list of possible leveled spells to cast with a Wild Shape character before Wild Shaping, it is exhaustive. So I am going to highlight options, with a bias towards Druid spells, but there's going to be lots and lots of spells that are potential spells for your Wild Shaping character that I'm not going to be able to cover. So what I want to do is start with like a simple tool set that you can use for your own spell evaluation. So when you look at your available spells, here's what you want to do. First, remember you can only concentrate on one spell at a time, so there's no point in weighing down your spell list with a bunch of concentration options unless each spell has a specific situation where it is the best choice. Non-concentration spells with durations are always going to be much more valuable because we can layer them up without having to worry about our concentration dropping. Also, Wild Shape has a long duration. unless we take enough damage to drop it early, so long durations on spells really stand out. We should consider our action economy, something like Call Lightning, for example. It could be used while wild-shaped, but if it's using our action every round, then we're not taking advantage of actions we might want to use while wild-shaped. So it's only really useful if we're wild-shaped into something where the actions aren't our focus. Like maybe we're wild-shaping into a flying form. Then we're mainly taking advantage of the flight speed while we rain down lightning bolts on non-flying enemies, for example. But spells that either aren't using our action after casting, or perhaps using our bonus action, tend to have more universal applications. So I'm going to use that criteria, and I'll highlight some spells that stand out for me, and we will start at first level spells. So, Fog Cloud. Fog Cloud has a really good duration, but we cannot move it, so this is still probably a one combat thing. The idea would be we cast Fog Cloud with our action, then we wild shape with our bonus, and then we take any movement needed. Fog Cloud is always a spell you want to coordinate with the rest of your group. Some character types can really get screwed over with a Fog Cloud, and we don't want that. Ideally, this would combine with a wild-shaped form with Blind Sight, though I think there is a case that the blind fighting combat style could carry over to wild shape as well, giving you Blind Sight 10 feet. I mean, special senses don't carry over very specifically, but I think at least thematically, blind fighting is exactly what it describes, a method of fighting that simulates blind sight. I mean, I think that's at least worth a conversation. Anyways, with Fog Cloud up, a wild-shaped form with blind sight has a lot of appeal. Of course, we can move around without provoking opportunity attacks. We should have advantage on our attacks, and attacks against us should have disadvantage. I'll touch a bit on the Darkness spell here as well. Now, Darkness is a second level spell, and it's not on the Druid spell list. But the obvious advantage of Darkness over Fog Cloud is you can cast it on an object, and then it moves with the object, meaning you could potentially get multiple combats out of that 10-minute duration. Fog Cloud, though, available to any Druid with Wild Shape. Longstrider. Okay, so the Longstrider spell doesn't use concentration, so it's one of those spells that you can layer with other spells, which is nice. Now, if I have 3 first level spell slots, and those are my only spells, I think Longstrider gives a fairly minor benefit for that kind of resource cost, but if we're getting into the higher levels on that spellcasting progression chart, then Longstrider becomes an ever easier spell to cast. And as mentioned, no concentration, pretty solid duration, and that flat plus 10 movement speed applies to your walking speed, but also any other movement speed you have as well. So climbing, burrowing, swimming, and flying. So that's a decent buff, as long as that one first level slot is low cost for your character. Goodberry. So this is an easy pick. It has no concentration, fantastic duration, and one first level slot is providing 10 hit points of healing. As a Moon Druid, we can spend spell slots while in Wild Shape to give ourselves some healing, but that's a D8 per spell slot level. So spending a first level slot after the fact averages out to 4.5 hit points healed, while Goodberry is providing more than twice that much. Though each berry is an action to eat, so this healing for the most part is going to be an out-of-combat thing. Armor of Agathis. So this isn't on the Druid spell list, so you'll need some other method to get it on your spell list. And like Longstrider, I wouldn't be spending slots on this if our spell slots are extremely limited. But Armor of Agathis is not using concentration, has a good duration, increases durability, and punishes melee enemies that hit us in combat. And as a Wild Shaper, we're probably mixing it up in melee. Armor of Agathis is most notable for how strong it upcasts with higher level slots, so even if you get Armor of Agathis with a single level class dip, we can use those higher level slots gained through Druid levels to get more out of this spell. One limiting factor is that temporary hit points don't stack, so this won't be a great pick if you have another reliable way of getting temps. Gift of Alacrity. So just a warning, this one is a Dunamancy spell from the Wildmount campaign setting, so this is not going to be available for every character. But if it is available to you, boosting initiative is really nice for a Wild Shaper because a lot of our forms aren't going to have strong initiative scores. This is also a pretty light investment for non-concentration 8-hour duration. If I have one first level spell slot to spend on a non-concentration spell, I would normally favor this spell over Longstrider if I had both available to use. Of course, if you have multiple slots available, layer them up. Hunter's Mark. So, natural weapons are weapons meaning Hunter's Mark should work in our wild shape form. This is a concentration spell, so if we use Hunter's Mark, that is our concentration. But we have a good duration, and we can up that duration with upcasting. And the value here is really going to depend on the number of attacks of our form. So, for the most part, our bonus action should be available for target switching, and with heavy multi-attacks, this increases in value. I should mention Hex will provide similar results, though the necrotic damage from Hex is going to be a little less reliable. So let's say we have 3 attacks with the multi-attack. Very possible, depending on the form we select. Then Hunter's Mark is probably adding 7 to our damage per round, assuming a 60% chance to hit. At higher levels, that's not a huge amount, but at lower levels, that's a very significant boost. Like with the Deinonychus, it's going to be about a 40% DPR boost. Let's move on to our second level spells. So, Barkskin. We should at least talk about Barkskin, even though I'm not going to give it a glowing recommendation here. Barkskin is a notoriously awful spell. It uses your concentration just to give you a very mediocre armor class with a second level spell. 16 just isn't that impressive in armor class for that kind of resource cost. Though we should consider that with Wild Shape, armor classes of 11, 12, and 13 are pretty common. So in those cases, armor class 16 is actually a pretty big boost. For very specific cases, like let's say you wanted to fill that doorway with your large-sized brown bear, and then you want to tank and do some doorway dodging. A 16 armor class could make a pretty big difference. My recommendation here is very tepid. I would not jump to be preparing Barkskin with my Druid, but when you have a terrible spell like Barkskin, it's at least notable when it might have an application here and there where it's less terrible. Wild Shaping Moon Druids are pretty much the only such application for Barkskin. Dark Vision. So, like the Light Cantrip, this is about forms without Dark Vision. Though I think there's a bit of a gray area in the Wild Shape rules for transferring over spell effects that provide special senses to Wild Shape. I think a lot of DMs would be just fine with this, and no concentration and really great duration. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this one. I think the application, it's fairly obvious. Moonbeam. So, short duration and concentration. But, as a setup for single combat, this isn't a bad choice if you have forced movement options. So what you would do is you would set up Moonbeam on round 1, probably right over an enemy, and then you would Wild Shape. They would take some damage on their turn, and of course move out of the Moonbeam. And then your party smack them back in. Maybe with the Crusher Feat, maybe with Grapple and Drag, and then they take damage immediately upon entering again, and then once again at the start of their turn. The idea here is to double up that damage as much as possible, ideally with multiple targets. It's also complementary with battlefield control set up by other characters, so if that wizard wants to drop a web, doubling up with the Moonbeam can be effective. Finally, when we're Wild Shape, our ranged options are probably pretty much non-existent. But we can move the Moonbeam 60 feet with our action, so it gives us an option there. Finally, this spell is on the Druid spell list. Pass Without Trace. So yes, it uses concentration, but it's on the Druid spell list and has a strong 1 hour duration. Now some encounters have some opportunity to set up Surprise, and others don't. If setting up Surprise is an option though, then Pass Without Trace increases your odds massively. And if you do surprise an enemy, the impact is absolutely massive. Deadly fights become very winnable. Protection from Poison. So this spell provides resistance to poison damage and advantage on saving throws against poison. Poisons are common in the game, and it just happens that poison resistance is the easiest to get. Like if you want lightning resistance with a duration of more than 1 round, we're talking about protection from energy. That's a 3rd level spell and uses your concentration. I mean, even then, I'm not sure I would spend that 2nd level spell slot for this spell unless I had a good idea that poisons were likely upcoming. But in that case, this is a must-have unless you already have poison resistance from another source, in which case someone in your party could likely still benefit from this. In some situations, I would quite happily spend every 2nd level spell slot I had getting resistance on as many party members as possible. Spike Growth. So overall, with a forced movement centered party, I would prioritize Spike Growth over Moonbeam. Moonbeam has its advantages, like the ability to move it and working against flying enemies, but Spike Growth doesn't limit how much damage a single creature can take by being pushed and dragged through it in a single turn. When you have a flying high-speed form like Air Elemental, you could grapple from above, then you could drag back and forth for some pretty big damage. Or you could use your Whirlwind for multiple enemies for 3d8 plus 2 plus 8d4 damage to each of them, plus knocking them prone. That's 35 damage to each one that failed to save. So let's move on to third level spells. Obviously, I will start with Conjure Animals. It uses your concentration, but the damage from your conjured animals will probably outdamage your attacks. Of course, since it's not using your action, it's all getting added together anyways. So instead of 1 brown bear, maybe now you have 3. Or, of course, you could have a pack of wolves to get that enemy prone for you to beat on. I've more recently talked about the issues with Conjure Animals if we want to be table friendly with our summoning, so I'll add in Summon Fae as an alternate, though if you have 4th level slots, Summon Fae does a lot better if you upcast it by 1 level. Fly. So, a lot of our potent wild-shaped forms don't fly. The Fly spell has a good duration, though it does use your concentration, and it upcasts well, targeting 1 additional creature per spell slot level. So generally speaking, our wild-shaped forms have no ranged options, which means against flying enemies we're pretty screwed unless we can get flight by some other means, like the Fly spell. Now, Fly is not on the Druid spell list. That means you would need to access it through some other means, or be very nice to the party wizard. Spirit Guardians. Again, not on the Druid spell list, so you need to access by some other means, and it uses your concentration, but has decent duration and it moves with you, so you can potentially use it for multiple combats. In addition to the obvious damage, it also reduces the movement of enemies inside the area. And what works really nice with Wild Shape is that Spirit Guardians flits 15 feet around our character. That means on a 2-dimensional grid, I'm just going to show you here. So the Spirit Guardians covers 48 squares if our character is medium sized. So if you see here, we have 7 squares times 7 squares to figure out our area. That's 49 squares minus the square we're occupying. But that's a medium sized character. If we're wild shaped into a large sized creature, look at that. So now it's 8 squares by 8, and that's 64 minus the 4 we're occupying, so now we're up to 60 squares. Now let's go huge. So now it's 9 by 9, or 81 minus the 9 squares we're occupying, so we're up to 72 squares. More squares means potentially more enemies are affected. And I'm just going to quickly recommend looking at rituals to save spell slots. Water Walk and Water Breathing are both Druid rituals and worth taking a look at. So let's move on to 4th level spells. This is kind of where I'm going to do my last in-depth look. Fire Shield. So Fire Shield wasn't a Druid spell until it got added in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, and it kind of hits all the marks for the kinds of spells we're looking for. It has a decent duration, doesn't use concentration, and it has both an offensive and defensive element. Creatures within 5 feet that hit us with a melee attack take damage, and we get resistance to either fire or cold damage. Now, a 4th level spell slot is getting into pretty hefty resource territory, but especially at those higher levels, Fire Shield is worth considering even if you don't know what kind of damages you'll be facing. If fire or cold damage are expected though, this is probably worth the casting even if 4th level is your highest level slot. Conjure Woodland Beings. So I don't have too much to say here beyond we get a lot of the same kind of value as Conjure Animals, with a lot more versatility in the kinds of things our summon creatures can do. Check out the link above for details on Conjure Woodland Being options. Again, pretty much any summoning is a pretty decent use of concentration for your wild-shaped druid, but this one is a notable option. Freedom of Movement. So 1 hour duration on the druid spell list, no concentration, and provides all kinds of benefits, including immunity to being paralyzed or restrained by spells or magical effects, the ability to ignore difficult terrain, the ability to fight underwater without penalties, and the ability to automatically escape grapples. So if these kinds of challenges are expected, then Freedom of Movement adds to our spell layering in Wild Shape. Stone Skin. Okay, back to tepid recommendations, because Stone Skin is not a good spell. It uses concentration, and it has that costly component that's consumed when casting the spell. However, we are talking about resistance to the 3 most common damage types in the game. Once Elemental Wild Shape is available, that's going to be built in. But in that level 7 through level 9 range, this is pretty much your only option for that. Resistance isn't just increasing the durability of your forms, but if you're facing attacks that do more than 20 points of damage, it's also bringing down those concentration saving throw DCs as well. So the DC of a concentration saving throw is half the damage you took, or 10, whichever is higher. So if you took 30 points of damage, that's a DC 15 saving throw. But if you have resistance to that damage, well then you actually take 15, and so the DC would be 10. Now, it just so happens this spell uses concentration, so the saving throw is to maintain this spell, but it does have built in that this might be an easier concentration to maintain than spells that don't have that defensive component, and this one is on the Druid spell list. So now we're going to be getting into legit high-level spells. At this point, either these spells won't be available due to multiclassing, or we're getting into such high levels that we might not achieve these levels anyways. And if we are going 18 levels in Druid, we can cast spells well wild-shaped, and that kind of changes everything. I will give a special shout out to Conjure Elemental. That can be a really good option. So you're an elemental, and then now you've doubled it up. Windwalk is a party-wide buff that gives great out-of-combat mobility options. And if you can afford to cast Hero's Feast, the benefits to the whole party are massive. And with spells like Awaken and Planar Binding, your ability to build armies of creatures under your control, they're exactly what you would expect from a high-level caster. Now, if you have experience in combining any of these spells with Wild Shape, I would love for you to share your experience below. Even more, if you've effectively used the spell I didn't cover in this video. In the next video in this series, I will be covering multi-class options, and then I'm going to finish up this series with a couple builds I think are pretty cool for higher level wild shaping characters. Otherwise, until next time, I am going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everybody, and I'll talk to you soon.